The courtroom air was stale, old carpet, fluorescent lights. Someone behind me kept clearing their throat. I heard my name before I saw my father's face. Not shouted, not announced, read aloud, from a document. His shoulders stiffened, just slightly. That's when I knew he hadn't expected me to be here. Before I tell you how we got here, you need to understand the rule my family lived by. I grew up inside a family system that didn't announce its rules out loud, but enforced them with precision. And the first thing you learned, long before you learned how to argue, was how to comply. In our house, affection wasn't withheld dramatically, it was quietly rescheduled. Approval came in measured doses, usually after you proved you could be predictable. My father believed order was love, and to be fair, he was consistent about it. He woke up at the same time every day, ate the same breakfast, and expected the same emotional discipline from everyone under his roof. You didn't interrupt him. You didn't contradict him in front of others, and you never ever turned a private disagreement into a public moment. That last one was the rule that mattered most, even if no one ever wrote it down. He said families survived on loyalty, but what he meant was silence. Growing up, holidays weren't celebrations so much as audits. Birthdays were observed, Thanksgivings were evaluated, and New Year's Eve, his favorite, was treated like a performance review for the entire year. Who showed growth? Who caused friction? Who stayed in line? Invitations weren't automatic, they were earned. If you were included, it meant you were still considered safe. If you weren't, the message didn't need explaining. As a kid, I learned to watch the guest list more closely than the calendar. I learned which cousins were suddenly busy this year, which relatives stopped being mentioned at dinner. No one talked about it, but everyone noticed. That was the family language, omission. My relationship with my father was polite, functional, and carefully managed. We talked about work, logistics, surface-level plans. We didn't talk about feelings unless they could be resolved quickly. When I grew older and started building a life that didn't orbit his expectations, the temperature shifted. Not suddenly, but gradually, like a room cooling after the heat's been turned off. He never told me to stop being independent. He just stopped rewarding it. Phone calls became shorter. Advice turned conditional. Praise disappeared unless it came with a reminder of how things used to be. Still, I stayed respectful. I showed up on time. I didn't push. I believed for a long time that compliance was the price of peace. New Year's Eve had always been the marker. No matter what else happened during the year, that night reset the board. We dressed well. We spoke carefully. We toasted to fresh starts, even when nothing had really changed. So when December rolled around that year, I assumed the ritual would hold. I hadn't argued with him. I hadn't raised concerns publicly. I hadn't done anything that would justify a rupture. Then, on December 29th, my phone buzzed with a message that was shorter than any conversation we'd had all year. No greeting, no explanation, just a sentence that landed heavier than it should have. Don't come this year. We need peace. I read it twice, then a third time, waiting for the follow-up that never came. There was no accusation to respond to, no misunderstanding to correct, just exclusion, delivered cleanly. The timing was intentional. Too late to ask questions without seeming dramatic. Too close to the holiday to involve anyone else without making a scene. That was another unspoken rule. If you reacted, you proved the punishment was justified. I sat there in the blue light of my phone, aware of how familiar the move was. It was management. I was being removed from the equation to preserve an image, and whatever the real issue was, it wasn't up for discussion. I felt embarrassed, even though no one else knew yet. I felt small, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. And underneath that, I felt something quieter but more dangerous. Clarity. Because for the first time, I understood that belonging in my family had never been unconditional. It had been provisional, renewed annually, and subject to revocation without appeal. I didn't respond right away. I set the phone down and listened to the room. My own place, my own space, realizing how different the silence felt when it wasn't imposed. What I didn't know yet was that this decision, meant to keep things contained, was about to do the opposite. Because while he thought he was closing a door, something else had already started opening, and the structure he relied on to control outcomes wasn't as solid as it used to be. At first, I treated the message like a misunderstanding that could be corrected with patience, because that's how I had been trained to respond. Slowly, carefully, without triggering another withdrawal of access. I waited a full day before replying, keeping my tone neutral, almost logistical, asking if we could talk when he had time, or if there was a specific concern I should address. There was no reply. That silence wasn't passive, it was strategic, and I recognized it because I had seen it used before on other people. When someone crossed an invisible line, communication didn't explode, it disappeared. I sent a second message, shorter, offering a compromise, saying I could stop by briefly or come later in the evening. Again, nothing. The absence of response did more than any argument could have done. It told me the decision had already been finalized, and my participation in it was no longer required. A few days later, small disruptions began to surface, subtle enough that I almost dismissed them at first. An online account I shared for years suddenly logged me out, and when I tried to reset the access, the recovery email had been changed. I told myself it was probably routine maintenance, maybe even a coincidence. Then a professional reference he had previously agreed to provide went silent, not declining, just not responding, leaving me in a position where I had to explain the gap without explaining the truth. When I reached out to a relative to ask if everything was okay, the reply I received didn't sound like them at all. Overly formal, oddly distant, as if it had been edited for tone. I stopped asking questions and started paying attention. I saved copies of older messages where expectations and permissions had been clearly stated. Not because I was planning a confrontation, but because something about the pattern felt off, like a system tightening rather than a person reacting. The more I stayed quiet, the more the boundaries shifted without my consent. Shared resources I had always been told were family matters were suddenly being managed without my input. Information I had previously been included in stopped arriving. I wasn't being yelled at or accused. I was being administratively erased. Then, 3 days before New Year's, my phone buzzed with a notification that didn't come from anyone in my family. It was from my bank. The language was neutral and procedural, the kind that's designed not to alarm you, but it caught my attention immediately, because it referenced activity I hadn't initiated. The message said they were conducting a routine compliance review and requested that I confirm whether recent changes to an account were authorized. I read it slowly, twice, feeling the shift in my stomach, before my mind caught up. The account in question wasn't secret or new. It was one I had been told was shared for convenience, with clear boundaries discussed years earlier. I logged in and saw a list of adjustments, small on their own, but unfamiliar. I didn't jump to conclusions. I called the number provided and waited on hold, listening to the faint instrumental music and the recorded assurances that my call was important. When a representative finally came on the line, her voice was calm, professional, and carefully non-committal. She explained that certain actions had triggered an automated review, and that they simply needed confirmation of authorization. She didn't say my father's name, but when I asked who had initiated the changes, she told me what the records reflected. Hearing it stated that way, flat, factual, time-stamped, did something to me. This wasn't about family dynamics or hurt feelings anymore. It was about documented actions. I thanked her and asked what the next steps were. She explained the process. I could submit a statement, provide any relevant documentation, and the bank would assess whether boundaries had been crossed according to their policies. I hung up and sat there for a long moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, noticing how quiet my apartment was. The open loop was suddenly clear to me, even if I didn't yet know where it led. The exclusion from New Year's wasn't an isolated punishment. It was a cover, a way to minimize contact, while decisions were being made without my involvement. I didn't confront my father. I didn't accuse him. I continued to document. I saved the bank email. I exported transaction logs. I organized everything chronologically, not out of anger, but out of a growing sense of responsibility to myself. Then, my phone rang. His name appeared on the screen, and for the first time since the message, he was calling. I let it ring. A minute later, it rang again. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to step back into a conversation where the rules had already been violated. A voicemail followed, short and unfinished. His voice clipped, telling me to call him back. I didn't. That silence was different from the one he had used on me. It wasn't meant to punish. It was meant to protect clarity. What I didn't know yet was that this administrative thread, the emails, the logs, the quiet review, was about to intersect with something much larger, and once that happened, there would be no way to frame this as a private family misunderstanding ever again. The escalation didn't arrive with confrontation or raised voices. It arrived with requests for clarification, delivered in careful language by people who had no emotional investment in my family dynamics. Within 48 hours of my initial call, the bank followed up with a secure email outlining the review process in more detail, explaining that when shared access intersects with changed authorizations, they're required to document intent, not just outcome. I was asked to submit a written statement describing my understanding of the account boundaries and to attach any records that supported that understanding. I approached it like I would any formal matter, keeping emotion out of it, sticking to timelines, using phrases like according to prior agreements and as reflected in earlier correspondence. As I compiled the materials, the patterns sharpened. Older emails clearly outlined limits that had been acknowledged at the time. Message threads showed consent given for specific actions and withheld for others. Screenshots captured dates and confirmations that hadn't seemed important when they were first sent, but now carried weight because they established continuity. Each piece alone was ordinary. Together, they formed a narrative that didn't rely on interpretation. I submitted the packet and received an automated confirmation, the kind that tells you your case has entered a queue and will be reviewed by a specialist. That word, reviewed, sat with me. It meant there would be an assessment, not an argument. In the days that followed, the pressure increased in ways that felt indirect but intentional. My father didn't reference the bank. He didn't mention New Year's again. Instead, he sent messages framed as concern, asking if everything was settled and reminding me how important it was to keep things within the family. I responded once, briefly, saying I was handling an administrative matter and would follow up when appropriate. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. Meanwhile, additional alerts came in. Not warnings, just notifications confirming that certain permissions had been paused pending review. That was the first official shift. No accusations, no penalties, just a temporary boundary imposed by an institution that didn't care about hierarchy or history. A few days later, I received a call from a compliance officer assigned to the case. Her tone was measured, almost reassuring, and she explained that her role wasn't to determine intent, but to verify alignment between documented permissions and recent actions. She asked questions that required precise answers. When was the account established? What were the original terms? Had those terms ever been formally revised? Each answer pointed back to the same documents I had already submitted. At one point, she paused and said, "According to the records, there appears to be a discrepancy." She didn't say misuse. She didn't say wrongdoing. She said discrepancy. That choice of word mattered. It acknowledged a divergence without assigning motive. After the call, she emailed a summary of our conversation and asked me to confirm its accuracy. I read it carefully, noting how neutral it was, how little room there was for reinterpretation. I replied with a simple confirmation. That email became part of the file. Around the same time, a different kind of pressure surfaced. Extended family members began reaching out with vague check-ins, asking if I was okay, mentioning that my father seemed stressed, hinting that things could be smoothed over if I just talked to him. None of them referenced specifics. None of them asked what had actually happened. They were responding to a version of events that hadn't been shared with me. I didn't correct them. I thanked them for checking in and said I was handling things appropriately. The silence I maintained wasn't strategic. It was necessary. Any attempt to explain would have been reframed as drama. Any defense would have been labeled disloyalty. Then, unexpectedly, a message arrived from outside the family entirely. The journalist, verifying a tip related to a broader piece on professional boundary disputes. The email was cautious, emphasizing that they were still in the fact-checking phase, and that no names would be used without confirmation. My name was mentioned only as a point of verification, not as an allegation. I didn't respond immediately. I reread the email, aware that this was the moment where a private review could intersect with public visibility. Before replying, I checked the status of the bank review. Another update had come in earlier that day, stating that the case had been escalated to a senior reviewer due to the clarity of the documentation. That phrase, clarity of the documentation, landed differently than everything else. It wasn't about volume. It was about alignment. I replied to the journalist with a short, factual response, confirming only what was already documented and making it clear that I wouldn't speculate or provide commentary beyond the records. They thanked me and said they would be in touch if needed. That night my father called again. This time he left a longer voicemail, his tone tight, asking why strangers were asking questions, warning me about consequences, reminding me of everything he had handled for me over the years. I listened once and archived it. The escalation was complete. The issue had moved beyond family narrative and into institutional process, where tone and history didn't carry the same weight as timestamps and policies. Whatever happened next would be decided by people who had never met either of us. And for the first time since this began, I felt something close to steadiness, not because I expected a particular outcome, but because the truth no longer depended on who spoke louder or who controlled the room. The public turning point didn't arrive with chaos or spectacle. It arrived quietly, wrapped in verification and timing, the way consequences usually do when they're earned rather than chased. The article went live early on a weekday morning, tucked into a broader report about boundary disputes and institutional reviews, written in language that was restrained and almost cautious, but precise. There were no accusations, no inflammatory quotes, just a summary of events according to records and as confirmed through documentation. And my name appeared once, embedded in a sentence that treated it like data rather than drama. I saw it because my phone began vibrating before I finished my coffee, notifications stacking without sound, as if the device itself understood that this wasn't a moment for noise. I sat there, noticing the pale winter light through the window, the faint smell of burnt toast from a neighbor's apartment. The ordinary world continuing as if nothing had changed, even though I knew it had. When I finally looked, the missed calls were already there, family members, unfamiliar numbers, and one from my father that came and went without a voicemail. By midday, the mediator's office confirmed the meeting time that had already been tentatively scheduled, now marked urgent. And when I arrived that afternoon, the room was exactly what you'd expect from a place designed to absorb tension without reacting to it. Neutral walls, muted chairs, a low hum from an overhead vent. My father was already there, seated stiffly, his coat still on, his eyes fixed on the table, as if he could organize the outcome by refusing to look at it. When the mediator entered, she carried a thin folder, not thick enough to feel dramatic, but substantial enough to matter. She began by outlining the purpose of the session, her voice steady, her words carefully balanced, and then she read from the summary. When she reached my name, she didn't pause, didn't emphasize it, just spoke it clearly, as if it belonged there. That was the moment the room changed. My father's jaw tightened, just slightly, and his hands, which had been folded neatly, separated and rested flat on the table. No one said anything. The silence wasn't awkward, it was heavy, the kind that settles when a narrative loses its grip. The mediator continued, referencing timelines, permissions, the outcome of the bank's internal review, which had concluded that certain actions exceeded documented authorization. She didn't speculate about intent, she didn't assign motive. She stated findings, according to policy, according to records, according to the documentation provided. Each phrase landed with the same weight, because none of them could be argued without introducing evidence that didn't exist. When she finished, she explained the immediate implications. Access would be formally revoked, boundaries clarified in writing, and a compliance note added to ensure no future ambiguity. It wasn't punitive, it was corrective. My father finally spoke then, his voice controlled but strained, asking how this had escalated so far without him being properly informed. The mediator responded calmly, explaining that notifications had been sent at each stage, and that the process didn't require consent once a review was triggered. The room went quiet again. That was the social payoff. Though it didn't look like triumph, it looked like recognition, the moment when control meets structure and finds it can't negotiate. The immediate fallout followed quickly, but without drama. The mediator summarized next steps, asked if there were questions, and when there were none, concluded the session. We stood at the same time, gathering our things with the awkward synchronization of people who no longer share a script. My father didn't look at me. He didn't need to. Outside, the hallway smelled faintly of cleaning solution, the kind used to reset spaces between conflicts. And as I walked away, my phone buzzed again, this time with a confirmation email outlining the formal boundary in plain language. It was done. Not symbolically, not emotionally, officially. Later that evening, messages circulated in the family group chat, carefully worded, acknowledging that things had gotten complicated, and that everyone hoped it would settle soon. There was nothing to clarify. The article had already been updated with a final line noting that the matter had been resolved through mediation, and by the next morning, the attention had moved on, as it always does. What remained wasn't public interest or vindication, but something quieter and more durable, a record, a line drawn by people whose job it was to recognize boundaries and enforce them without bias. Sitting alone that night, listening to the distant sound of traffic and the muted pop of fireworks someone was setting off early, I realized that the climax of this story wasn't the exposure or the panic. It was the moment when the truth no longer required my participation to stand. The result didn't announce itself with relief or celebration. It unfolded slowly, in confirmations and quiet adjustments, the kind that only feel significant once you notice how little resistance remains. Within 24 hours of the mediation, the formal documents arrived, written in plain language, outlining the boundaries that were now fixed rather than implied, specifying access that no longer existed, and procedures that would apply going forward, not as punishment, but as structure. I read them carefully, not because I expected surprises, but because for the first time, the limits were no longer dependent on memory or tone or family interpretation. They were written down. The bank followed with its own notice, confirming that the review was closed, the temporary restrictions made permanent, and that any future changes would require direct authorization from me alone. There was no invitation to discuss it further, no emotional framing, just a clean end to a process that had reached its conclusion. That finality settled in slowly. I noticed it first, in the absence of messages. My phone stayed quiet in a way it never had before, not because people were angry, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. The calls stopped. The half-explanations ceased. Even the indirect pressure, those vague check-ins and carefully phrased concerns, faded as it became clear there was no path back to the old arrangement. When my father finally reached out, it wasn't to argue or justify himself. It was a brief message acknowledging that the situation had gone further than expected, and that he hoped time would smooth things out. I didn't respond right away, not out of spite, but because the words no longer demanded immediate management. I wasn't responsible for restoring equilibrium anymore. A few days later, I replied with a single sentence, calm and factual, saying that the boundaries were now clear and that I would be maintaining them. There was no follow-up. That silence felt different from all the others that had come before. It wasn't imposed. It was mutual. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle shifts in myself that I hadn't anticipated. I slept more deeply. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. The low-level vigilance I had carried for years, the instinct to anticipate reactions, to soften statements before making them, began to loosen its grip. Even New Year's Eve passed quietly, without the familiar tension of wondering where I stood. I spent it alone, but not in isolation. I cooked a simple meal, opened a window to let in the cold air, and listened to distant fireworks echo across the city, each pop marking a transition I hadn't been allowed to claim before. There was no toast to reconciliation, no resolution speech, just the steady realization that I had chosen stability over access, and that choice had held. Professionally, the outcome mattered too. The reference I had lost was replaced, this time by someone who didn't require loyalty in exchange for support. The administrative clarity allowed me to move forward without hesitation or explanation, and when questions arose, I had answers that didn't depend on personal history. Everything that had once felt precarious now felt boringly functional, which I came to understand was the point. Even within the family, the dynamic shifted. Conversations became more neutral, less performative. No one asked me to smooth things over or be the bigger person. The structure had done what emotion never could. It removed ambiguity. I didn't gain approval, but I gained predictability, and that turned out to be far more valuable. Looking back, the quiet win wasn't that my father lost control, or that the situation became public. It was that I stopped participating in a system that required my silence to function. The result wasn't revenge or validation. It was ownership. Ownership of my decisions, my boundaries, my time. The story didn't end with reconciliation or estrangement. It ended with alignment, where my actions matched my values without requiring permission. That alignment carried a kind of peace that didn't need to be defended. Even now, when I think about that year, what stands out isn't the tension or the fallout, but the moment I realized that boundaries, once formalized, don't argue back. They just stand there, quiet and firm, allowing everyone involved to decide what they're willing to respect.